It took minutes, not hours, not days, not the slow rising of a river that gives people time to gather what they can and flee to higher ground. Minutes, in less time than it takes to make a cup of tea, a wall of water came down out of the high Himalaya and tore through the valleys along the border, and by the time it had passed, hundreds of people were dead, and around 1,000 more were simply gone, swept away, unaccounted for, missing in a way that may never be resolved. That is the almost incomprehensible horror at the center of this disaster, the speed of it, the way an ordinary day in the mountains became, in the space of a few minutes, one of the deadliest flash floods the region has ever seen. Killing faster than anyone could run, faster than anyone could warn, faster than the human mind can even prepare for. And now, in the aftermath, the most agonizing fact of all hangs over everything, which is that roughly 1,000 people still cannot be found, not confirmed dead, not rescued, simply missing somewhere in the wreckage of the valleys or the depths of the swollen river or the debris the flood left behind. 1,000 human beings whose fate remains, for now, unknown, and 1,000 families somewhere waiting in unbearable uncertainty for word that may take days or weeks or that may never come at all. Before we go further, a quick word, because a lot of people watch these all the way through and forget to subscribe. If you want to follow a story like this properly, as it develops, hit subscribe. It is free, it takes a second, and it makes sure the next update reaches you. So subscribe, stay with me, and now, let us begin. To understand how a flood can kill hundreds in minutes, you have to understand what a flash flood in a steep mountain valley actually is, because it is a fundamentally different thing from the floods most people imagine. When people picture a flood, they usually picture a slow one, a river swelling over days as the rain accumulates, the water creeping up inch by inch, giving people time to see it coming and to move. A flash flood in the high mountains is the opposite of that in every way. It is not a slow rise, but a sudden surge, a mass of water released all at once and sent racing down a narrow valley with terrible speed. And the geography of these mountains makes it far worse, because in a steep, narrow valley there is nowhere for the water to spread out and dissipate its energy. Instead, the valley walls channel and concentrate the flood, funneling all of its force down the narrow floor, so that it arrives not as a gentle rise, but as a moving wall of water and rock and mud, filling the valley from side to side, traveling faster than a person can run, striking everything in its path with the force of a landslide. There is no gradual warning, no slow climbing of the water that lets people react. There is only the ordinary valley one moment, and the wall of water the next, and for the people on the valley floor, in the villages and the towns and along the trails, there is almost no time at all, a few seconds perhaps. A distant roar and then the flood itself, arriving before anyone can reach safety. Here is where you can help me, and it takes only a second. If you are from Nepal or anywhere in the Himalayan region, or you have family or friends near these mountains, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read them, and it helps me understand who this story is reaching. And it lets others following this know they are not alone in caring. It costs nothing, and it means more than you would think. And that is exactly why the death toll was so high and so sudden, because the flood struck communities that were entirely unprepared, that could not have been prepared, for a thing that gave no warning. Along these border valleys are villages where people have lived for generations, clinging to the narrow strips of habitable ground beside the river, and towns that have grown up around the crossing points between two countries, and, at this time of year, trekking areas full of travelers who come to walk among the greatest mountains on earth. When the flood came, in the space of minutes, it came upon all of them at once, the sleeping villagers, the workers at the border, the trekkers in the high valleys, and it gave them no chance. It carried off homes with the people still inside them. It swept away vehicles and goods and everything staged at the crossings. It destroyed a bridge that connected two nations, severing the link between them and cutting off the very route that rescuers would need. And in the space of those few minutes, it killed hundreds of people and swept away 1,000 more. An entire catastrophe compressed into a span of time so short that for most of the victims, there was no decision to make, no action to take, no time to do anything at all but be overtaken by the water. This is the particular terror of the flash flood, that it removes the one thing that might save a person, which is time, and leaves them with nothing. If this is helping you understand what really happened up there, do me two quick favors that keep a channel like this going. Tap the like button so more people see the real story as it develops. And more importantly, share this with someone in your family who follows the region or has loved ones who travel there, because getting the real picture out matters, and they may not have heard. That one share could reach exactly the person who needs it, and it costs you nothing. A like and a share with your family, and then we keep going, because the fate of the 1,000 missing is where this story now lives. Let us turn then to that number, the 1,000 still missing, because it is the heart of the ongoing tragedy and the hardest part of the whole disaster to comprehend. When a catastrophe leaves hundreds confirmed dead, but around 1,000 missing, the missing occupy a terrible middle ground, neither counted among the dead nor found among the living, their fate genuinely unknown. Some of them, we can hope, are still alive, trapped or stranded in the high valleys, cut off by the destruction, but surviving, waiting to be reached. And every one of them who is found alive is a life pulled back from the count of the lost. But many of the missing, in a disaster of this violence, will not be found alive. They will have been carried away by the water, buried under debris, swept into the swollen river and taken far downstream, lost in places so remote or so buried that they may never be recovered at all. And this is what makes the number so agonizing, because it means that the true death toll is not the hundreds already confirmed, but something potentially far higher, that the missing are, in the grimmest sense, a measure of how much worse the final count may become. For the families of the 1,000, this is a torment almost beyond imagining. To know that their loved one was there when the flood came and is now simply gone, not confirmed dead, but not found alive, suspended in an uncertainty that offers neither the hope of a rescue nor the terrible closure of a confirmed death, only the waiting, day after day, for news that comes slowly, if it comes at all. To feel what killing in minutes actually means, imagine it from inside one of those villages. It is an ordinary moment, people going about their lives, some asleep, some working, some sharing a meal, the river running as it always has, giving no sign. And then, from somewhere up the valley, comes a sound, a deep and growing roar, unfamiliar and wrong. And in the seconds it takes to register that something is happening, to look up, to wonder, the wall of water is already there. There is no time to gather the children, no time to reach the higher ground, no time even to fully understand what is coming before it arrives. In the space of a breath, the world that had stood for generations, the homes, the streets, the people, is struck by a force beyond anything the valley has ever known and swept away. For the people in its path, the entire event, from the first distant roar to being overtaken by the water, may last only seconds, a span of time so short that survival often came down not to any decision or action, but to the sheer accident of where a person happened to be standing when the flood arrived. This is what it means for a flood to kill in minutes, that it collapses the whole span of a disaster, the warning and the flight and the escape that other catastrophes allow, into a few seconds that offer no chance to do anything at all, and that is why so many were lost so fast, an entire community's fate decided in the time it takes to realize that the roar in the distance is death arriving. The reason 1,000 people can vanish so completely comes down to the nature of the flood and the terrain it struck, and it is worth understanding because it explains why the search is so difficult and the uncertainty so deep. A flash flood of this violence does not leave its victims where they fell. It carries them, sweeping people and everything else along in its churning mass of water and rock, depositing them far from where they were taken, in the debris fields, buried in mud and rubble, wedged among boulders, or carried into the river and swept miles downstream. In the vast, rugged, remote landscape of these mountains, a person swept away by such a flood could come to rest in 100 places that are nearly impossible to find, and the flood's destruction of the roads and bridges means that many of those places cannot even be reached by the searchers. Whole stretches of the valleys are cut off, accessible only by helicopter and only when the weather allows, so that vast areas where the missing might be have not yet even been searched. And the flood struck a place crowded with people whose exact numbers were never fully known, the shifting population of a border crossing, the travelers passing through, the trekkers scattered along the trails, so that establishing even who was present, who was accounted for, and who is truly missing is itself an enormous challenge. All of this together is why 1,000 people can be missing and stay missing, why the number resolves so slowly, why the families must wait so long, because the flood scattered its victims across a landscape that fights the searchers at every turn. And I know, this is the second time I am going to ask, so I will keep it quick. If you have made it this far, you clearly want to follow this properly, not just skim a headline, and that is exactly who I make these videos for. Subscribing is the one small thing that keeps the updates coming. That is all. Now, back to it, because the question of where the water came from is the key to understanding why this keeps happening. So where did it come from, this sudden wall of water that killed in minutes? The answer lies high in the mountains, in the ice and the lakes among the peaks, and in one of the most dangerous and least understood threats in all the high mountains of the world. The flood was triggered by a collapse in the glaciated heights, the sudden failure of ice, and the bursting of a glacial lake, releasing its stored water in an instant to come crashing down into the valleys below. In the high mountains, as the glaciers melt, the meltwater collects in lakes held back by natural dams of loose rock and ice and debris, the rubble left behind by the glaciers themselves. These lakes can grow large, holding enormous quantities of water high above the inhabited valleys, held in place only by these fragile natural barriers. And when one of those barriers fails, whether because ice or rock falls into the lake and sends a wave over the dam, or because the dam collapses, or because a piece of the glacier itself gives way, the lake can empty in minutes, releasing all of its water at once in a sudden, catastrophic flood. This is a glacial lake outburst flood, and it is exactly the kind of event that produces a wall of water capable of killing hundreds in minutes, because all of that stored water, gathered over years in the high mountains, is released in a single violent moment and sent racing down into the valleys where people live. And these disasters are becoming more common and more dangerous because of the warming of the climate, which is transforming the high mountains faster than almost anywhere on Earth. The great mountain ranges of Asia hold the largest store of ice outside the polar regions, so much that the region is sometimes called the third pole, and that ice is melting rapidly as the world warms, with the warming amplified at these high altitudes. As the glaciers melt, more meltwater collects in more and larger lakes, so the number and the size of these dangerous lakes has been growing across the high mountains, more and more of them forming among the peaks, each one a potential flood held back by a fragile dam. And the warming also destabilizes the mountains themselves. Thawing the frozen ground that once held the slopes and the glaciers together, making the collapses and failures that trigger these floods more likely. So the warming is loading the high mountains with more water and more precarious lakes, while making the failures that release them more frequent, a double increase in the danger. And this disaster is a direct and terrible expression of that growing threat. One more glacial flood in a region where they are becoming more common with each passing year. Now let us return to the ground, to the desperate search that is unfolding right now. Because for the 1,000 missing, everything depends on it, and it is a search of the most difficult kind imaginable. Consider what the searchers are up against. The disaster struck a remote, high-altitude region where access was hard even before the flood, and the flood has made it far worse, destroying the roads and bridges that would carry rescuers and aid into the area, so that much of the disaster zone is now cut off. Helicopters have become the lifeline. The only way to reach many of the stranded and to search the isolated valleys, but helicopter operations in these high mountains are dangerous and weather dependent, grounded whenever the clouds close in, able to carry only a few people at a time in the thin, high-altitude air. The search itself must cover a vast, rugged landscape, with the missing potentially scattered anywhere across it, in debris fields and riverbeds and buried places that are hard to see and harder to reach, and it must be conducted under the constant threat of further floods and landslides, in terrain that is dangerous even to the searchers. And over all of it hangs the pressure of time, because for any of the missing who are still alive, trapped or injured or stranded, every hour reduces their chances. And the searchers know that the window in which a rescue is still possible is closing even as they work. It is one of the hardest kinds of search and rescue there is, in one of the hardest environments on the planet, and it will determine how many of the 1,000 missing are found alive, how many are recovered, and how many are never found at all. And behind the number of the missing is a form of suffering that does not end when the flood does, the prolonged torment of the families who are waiting. For them, the disaster is not a single event that is past, but an ongoing ordeal with no resolution, because their loved one is neither confirmed dead nor found alive, only missing. And so they cannot grieve, and they cannot hope in any settled way, only wait, suspended between the two. They watch the news for every update. They contact the authorities. They travel toward the disaster zone if they can. They cling to the possibility that their husband or their daughter or their mother is among the stranded yet to be reached, while dreading the news that they are among the dead not yet found. And for many of them, that resolution may be a very long time coming, or may never come at all, because in a disaster of this kind, not everyone who is lost is ever recovered, so that some families will be left permanently without an answer, without a body to bury, without the certainty that would let them begin to move forward. This is the quiet, prolonged human cost that lives behind the number of the missing, 1,000 families thrown into an uncertainty that may stretch for weeks or months or forever. And it is a suffering that will continue long after the world's attention has moved on from the disaster, borne privately by the people whose loved ones the flood took but did not return. There is a deeper significance to this catastrophe that reaches beyond the immediate horror, because as devastating as it is on its own, it is also a warning about a threat that hangs over the entire Himalayan region and the vast populations that live below it. There are thousands of glacial lakes scattered across the high mountains of Asia. And as the climate continues to warm and the glaciers continue to melt and collapse, more of these lakes are forming and growing, and a significant number of them are considered dangerous, capable of bursting to send floods down into the valleys below. And those valleys are home to enormous numbers of people, communities strung along the rivers that flow down from the mountains. Along with the travelers who come to the region in growing numbers, all of them sitting, often unknowingly, in the potential path of a glacial flood that could arrive, like this one, in minutes and without warning. This disaster is one lake, one collapse, one catastrophe, but it is not unique, and it will not be the last. Because the same forces that produced it are at work across the entire region, loading more and more of these mountains with the potential for the same kind of sudden, deadly flood. The hundreds killed here in minutes, and the thousands still missing, are, in the largest sense, an early and terrible cost of a danger that is only beginning to reveal its full and growing scale. There is a hard injustice woven through this, which deserves to be named, because the people who suffer most from these disasters did the least to cause the warming that drives them. The mountain communities of these valleys are for the most part poor communities living close to the land, contributing almost nothing to the global emissions that are warming the planet and melting the glaciers above them, and yet they are on the front line of the consequences, among the first and the hardest hit. The people swept away in minutes by this flood had done nothing to bring it down upon them, and yet it came, born of a warming that others, far away, largely caused. This is one of the recurring cruelties of the changing climate, that its earliest and most severe impacts so often fall on those least responsible for it, and this disaster is a stark example. A poor mountain region devastated by the meltwater of glaciers, warmed by the emissions of distant, wealthier places, its people killed, and its families left searching for the thousand who cannot be found. And this is not the first time this stretch of the mountains has been struck by a disaster of exactly this kind, which is part of what makes it so alarming. The same region has been hit before by floods carrying the same signature, water surging down from the melting heights above, tearing away the bridges and the crossings and the communities below, killing and displacing the people in the valleys. When a place is struck once by such a catastrophe, it can be called a tragic accident, a piece of terrible luck. When it is struck again by the same mechanism in the same valleys, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and it stops being an accident and becomes a trend, the visible edge of a changing climate reaching down into the same vulnerable places again and again. The people of these valleys are not being unlucky once. They are living beneath mountains that keep producing the same catastrophe, where the lakes keep forming and bursting, where the danger is not a single event that is past, but a recurring threat that returns. And each new flood is another confirmation that this is the new and terrible reality of life beneath these melting peaks. To treat this disaster as a freak event, a one-time tragedy, would be to miss its most important lesson, which is that it is part of a pattern that is only growing, a preview of more to come unless something changes. So is there anything that can be done in the face of a threat like this, or must we simply accept a rising tide of these disasters? There is a great deal that can be done, and it is worth ending on the real possibilities, because these catastrophes are not entirely beyond our power to reduce. The dangerous glacial lakes can be identified and monitored. Using satellites and field surveys to find the ones most likely to burst or collapse and to watch them for signs of failure. Early warning systems can be installed on the most dangerous lakes, sensors that detect the beginning of an outburst and send an alarm down the valley, giving the communities and the travelers below the precious minutes they need to reach high ground. The very minutes that this flood so cruelly denied its victims. Some lakes can even be made safer, their water levels lowered by engineering to reduce the pressure on their dams. Communities can be taught to recognize the danger and know where to flee, and the trekking routes can be assessed for their exposure so that travelers understand the risk. And the cross-border cooperation that these shared hazards demand can be built so that a danger high in one country can be watched for the sake of the people it threatens in another. None of this can eliminate the danger, especially as the warming continues to make these floods more frequent, but all of it can reduce the toll, can give people the one thing this flood took from them, which is warning, and with it, the time to escape. The technology and the knowledge exist. What is needed is the will and the resources and the cooperation to deploy them before the next lake bursts. So as the search goes on for the 1,000 who cannot be found, as the helicopters fly whenever the weather allows and the families wait in an agony of uncertainty, this catastrophe stands as both a present tragedy and a warning about the future. It is a tragedy first, a real and terrible loss of life, hundreds killed in minutes, 1,000 still missing, entire villages swept away. A stretch of border between two nations devastated in the space of a few minutes, and that loss deserves to be mourned and honored and not reduced to a mere statistic. But it is also a warning, a clear and urgent one, about a danger that is growing across the entire roof of the world as the warming climate melts and destabilizes the great glaciers of Asia, filling the high mountains with more and larger lakes held back by more fragile dams, poised above the valleys where hundreds of millions live. This disaster is what that danger looks like when it strikes. Sudden and violent and giving no warning, killing in minutes and leaving 1,000 people lost, and it will strike again in other valleys below other lakes. Unless the warnings are heeded and the systems are built and the deeper cause, the warming itself is confronted. The mountains are changing. The ice that has held its place for thousands of years is melting and collapsing, and the water it releases is coming down into the valleys where people live, in floods like this one, that kill in minutes and take away 1,000 souls at once. And so, as the toll is still being counted and the missing are still being searched for, the least the rest of us can do, watching from far away, is to understand what has happened and why. To recognize that this is not a random act of nature, but the increasingly frequent consequence of a warming world, falling first and hardest on the mountain communities least responsible for it. To hold in our minds the human reality behind the numbers, the hundreds killed in the space of minutes, and the 1,000 whose fate is still unknown, the families waiting for word that may never come. And to resolve that the warnings offered by disasters like this one should not be wasted, that the monitoring and the warning systems and the cooperation that could give the next valley the minutes it needs should be built, so that fewer people have to face what these people faced, a wall of water out of the mountains with no warning and no time and no escape. The valleys are a scene of catastrophe tonight, hundreds dead in minutes and 1,000 still lost among them, and the mountains above, warming still, hold more water yet, in more lakes, above more villages, waiting for the next collapse, the next flood, the next few minutes that will change everything for the people in the valleys below. No warning came for them. The least we can do is make sure warning comes for the next.